Shalom Aleichem. I would like to discuss the halachot of Purim. The halachot of Purim really fall into four different categories. Hilchot Megillah, Matanot le'evyonim, Su'udah, and Mishloach Manot. We'll take them one at a time and we'll see. Okay, let's focus on Megillah. The first question I'd like to ask is the chiyuv Megillah, is it a mitzvah d'oraita or is it a mitzvah d'rabbanan? I know what you're thinking, right? How in the world could it possibly be a mitzvah d'oraita if the Megillah happened way after Matan Torah? So it couldn't possibly be d'oraita. It would have to be a d'rabbanan. But interestingly enough, the Bahag, the Baal Hilchot Gedolot, actually counts it in his minyan ha-mitzvot. To which you might ask, how could that be? I would say one good theory is to say that the yesod of reading the Megillah, of Pirsumi Nisa, is the fact that when a HaKadosh Baruch Hu does a nes for Klal Yisrael and saves Klal Yisrael, there is an obligation to advertise that. And he understood the foundation, the yesod of that advertisement is a mitzvah d'oraita. Obviously, all of the Rishonim hold it's a d'rabbanan, but it's quite possible that we could touch on a couple of nafkaminot, whether you look at it as a yesod similar to a d'oraita or d'rabbanan. One halacha we come across is the Birkat Megillah. Okay, we make an Al Mikra Megillah, we make a Sha'asa Nisim Lavotenu, okay, and we make a Shechianu as well in the morning. According to other dayot, you make a Shechianu at night and in the morning. Okay, now the Magen Avram, the Pri Megadim, hold that the reason why you make specifically a Bracha Shechianu in the morning is because the Iker mitzvah is in the day, and a person should be mechavein when making the bracha of Shechianu, and this is something that's announced in yeshiva all the time, but I think in many shuls, that you should have kavanah for all four mitzvot. To be mechavein, to be mekayim, the birchat Shechianu, for Mishloach Manot, for Sudat Purim, for Matanot le'evyonim as well, not just the Mikra Megillah. An interesting question is raised by the Bir Halacha, in quoting the Meiri, where he said that the concept of Shechianu, Me'ikar Adin, is really on the day, which is easily debatable. In other words, is it a day on the level of a Chag that deserves a Shechianu like all the other Chagim, or is it not? Anyway, the Meiri presents a possibility that indeed the Shechianu, the Yisor of the Shechianu, is on the day. And the nafkamina, and just that Chazal later on decided that, okay, it's on the day, but we're going to be masmichit to the Iker mitzvah of the day, which is Mikra Megillah, and that's why we make a Shechianu before Mikra Megillah. What would happen if you were a Chayal in Miluim and you didn't have a Megillah on Purim? You didn't have the ability to make a bracha. Would you make the Shechianu anyway or not? And unfortunately, the Bir Halacha leaves it at a tzarech iyon, whether you'd make the Shechianu, but that's one of the questions that are raised. At the end of Mikra Megillah, we make the bracha haravet rivenu. In most kehilot, haravet rivenu. Now, an interesting question is raised about din kedima on the mitzvah of Megillah, and it's found in the Gemara Megillah Daf Gimel. And this is how we paskin. The Rambam says, mevatlim Talmud Torah v'kal v'chomer shar mitzvot. Likrot Megillah, meaning to say that if you have a regular chavrut at that time, or regular shir at that time, you're supposed to be mevatel your Talmud Torah to be mekayim Mikra Megillah, and then he adds kal v'chomer, if you're going to be mevatel Talmud Torah, kal v'chomer shar mitzvot. It's an interesting kal v'chomer. As a matter of fact, Rav Lichtenstein Zatzal has an entire shir on the nature of mevatel Talmud Torah, whether it's such a great kal v'chomer as far as shar mitzvot. We're not going to go into that. But there's a machloket between the Rishonim, where the Ran says that the Gemara means mevatlin Talmud Torah v'kal v'chomer shar mitzvot, that's only limited to if you're able to be mekayim the mitzvah d'oraita later. And the reason why he says this is because there's an obvious question, before we raise the question, that the whole mitzvah, Mikra Megillah, is a d'Rabbanan. And if it's a d'Rabbanan, how could a mitzvah d'Rabbanan possibly be mevatel, completely be mevatel a mitzvah d'oraita? But if I understand that the din of mevatlim is just a din of pushing it off, a din kedima, and I'm not really completely mevatel mitzvah deraita, then it makes more sense. And that's how the Ran explains it, and indeed, that's how the Ramah paskins. That you could only be mevatel mitzvah deraita if it means pushing off the mitzvah deraita to be mekayim the mitzvah deraita later. But if it means that by going to listen to Mikra Megillah, you're going to miss out on a mitzvah deraita forever, according to the Ramah, you're not allowed to. And it's better to do the mitzvah deraita and miss out on Megillah. The Gra, however, is cholek. The Gra, and as well as the Taz, they hold lahalacha, that even if it means missing a mitzvah deraita, the mitzvah of Megillah takes precedence. Why? Because divrei Kabbalah is like a divrei Torah, meaning that Chazal have the power to wave a magic wand, a rabbinic magic wand, and actually empower the mitzvah of listening to Mikra Megillah to be on the level of a dioraita. And therefore, when faced with having to choose Megillah or some other mitzvah dioraita, Megillah will really win over. Another nafkamina, understanding exactly the level of significance of Mikra Megillah, would be the question of a suffix. Let's say a person lives in a city which is suffix mukaf. As you know, a city that's mukaf miyamei Yoshua ben Nun would read on Tetvav, what we call Shushan Purim. A city that all other cities in the world, right, would read on Yudalid. But what if you're not sure if where you live was mukaf? Or a very common suffix around Yerushalayim is you're not sure whether the place that you live in halachically has a din of Yerushalayim, of being mukaf. It's a question that throughout generations of the rebuilding of Yerushalayim, poskim dealt with. Rav Tukachinsky, many other poskim later. As an example, originally they asked whether Beit Vagan was considered mukaf. I heard from Yedaya Zal that even the area of the Tachana Merkazit, that area where there's a couple of houses, originally, when it was settled, there was a huge gap between that and Yerushalayim, and a big machloket among the local rabbanim, whether they should be reading like Yerushalayim at Tedvav, or they should be reading on Yudalid. Okay? So, the question is, if you're in a suffix, mukaf, you don't know whether Mikra din you should be reading on Yudalid at Tedvav, what do? So normally, if it be a deraita, you say suffix deraita l'chumra, and you'd have to read on 2 days. Here, the Ramban, the Rashba, the Ritva, the Ran, all hold lakula, that you read only on 1 day, while the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch paskin l'chumra, meaning you have to read on 2 days because of the suffix, mimicking a type of suffix deraita l'chumra. Another din that exists when it comes to Kriyat Megillah is Barov Am Hadrat Melech. Barov Am Hadrat Melech means that you should always seek to join a minyan that is the largest minyan around, because you want to add to the multitude. With the multitudes is the glory of the king of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which is an interesting question. If there's a din of Rav Am Hadrat Melech, so then there should, in any city or any neighborhood there should only be 1 minyan, because everybody should gravitate to the minyan. But the poskim say that no, they were talking about a situation, if you have a makam kavua, a minyan kavua, so you always go to a minyan kavua, you do not travel to a larger minyan. But if you don't have a makam kavua, so you're supposed to travel to a larger minyan. This din of Rov HaMadras Melech also carries in it the din of mevatlin Talmud Torah, meaning if you don't have a permanent minyan, and you know that you can go to the great synagogue or whatever, the biggest minyan in the area, but it'll take you a 15-minute trip, and you're going to miss out of 15 minutes with your chavrusa to do that. So it also falls under the din of mevatlin Talmud Torah for the kiyum of Rov Am Hadras Melech. Okay, yeah, I think this ends our first section, okay, on the mitzvah of Mikra Megillah. Thank you very much.